Let's talk about national debt again. Hi, I'm John McNeil, and this is the Invest Strong Network. Welcome. So, our nation passed a rather momentous milestone very recently. $30 trillion of national debt. Now, that number is almost unfathomable for most people, but for government accountants, they certainly understand the ramifications of it. And it will absolutely have real world effects on the American people. That's you and that's me going forward into the future. Now, until this point, our nation has been really kept buoyant through the tremendous uh, spending and debt spree in over the last, say, 20 years or so by three things. First of all, as the world's leader in innovation and economic growth, steady economic growth, investors globally are still rushing to the US to own our debt, right? And that's a real blessing. And into that, I'll toss in the political stability and order of law that has made up the United States of America really for the last uh, 240 something years. This has reinforced in uh, global investors that the debt of the United States of America is worth buying and worth owning. That's one. Number two, we've been kept buoyant by the fact that really at this point there's nowhere else to go, right? So all of the advanced nations and certainly all of the emerging nations are all deadened with all burdened rather with massive debt loads. And ours is in fact really not the worst. When you look at Japan and member states of the European Union, their debt actually makes ours look like a piece of cake, right? So, with that being the case, uh, we still look pretty handsome to persons around the world who want to own our debt, right? That's a blessing. Three, when we look at the 30 trillion number, that number is a little fungible, right? So 30 trillion is the overall debt load that our government, federal government, is holding. Now, fortunately, uh, m- quite a bit of that debt is actually a debt that is owed to other government agencies, right? Social Security Administration, the Federal Reserve, others. Now, it is still technically debt, and we'll put debt in air quotes here. But as I mentioned in a previous vid from 2020, if a man, a husband, owes his wife a certain amount of money, is that really considered a debt? Well, in fact, like I mentioned, for technical purposes, the answer is yes. But in the reality, uh, the federal government owing about, shall we say, 27% of that 30 trillion to other government agencies, many people actually they'll just shave off around $9 trillion from the cost of the 30, because the rest of that is debt that is owed to outside entities, the American people, or foreign governments, or sovereign funds, and things like that. So it would be, again, going back to our analogy, as if this husband, now he not only owes money to the wife, but he owes money to the bank, and owes money on his credit card, and then also owes money to his neighbor. Now, that's very different debt, right? And that's real debt that he's going to have to pay back at some point in the future. Now, So with those three things going on, uh, we are hanging buoyant for the moment, right? The question is, even if you back out, say, 9 trillion or 8 trillion out of the 30 trillion number, can our government, can our economy continue to sustain this level of debt going into the future? And let me tell you, the answer is no, right? There will come a point, there will come a point when this stuff becomes untenable. And the big problem that I see is that the powers that be in Washington, in the Biden administration, and in the Congress, and really on both sides of the political parties, they just do not seem interested in bringing the federal expenditures and taxation into into some kind of equilibrium. They just don't seem interested in it. And that just bodes terribly for the future, because this 30 trillion number, that is not a static number. So we're talking 30 trillion and counting, right? And actually counting very quickly, I might add. Okay, after looking at that, are we headed down the road of Weimar Germany, or Zimbabwe, or Turkey, or Venezuela, or something like that? Well, no, and for the previously three mentioned reasons. But that's not to say that this massive level of debt, federal debt, will not have a profound impact on investors and just people in general. How so, you ask? Well, going forward, and in fact, we've already begun to feel it. Inflation will kick up, and this pickup in inflation, this is going to be perhaps a long term thing. Right now, it may not be long term at 7.5% as they have calculated it at this point, but it will be elevated long term compared to the recent historical target of 2.5% from the Federal Reserve, right? So in fact, we may be looking at 4 to 6% inflation year over year for as far as the eye can see, so long as we continue to amass monstrous debts like this. Now, that would be, in fact, quite similar to what happened in Britain at the end of the Second World War, and also, excuse me, also contemporary Japan, both of which had ginormous debt loads caused, well, first by the Second World War in the case of Britain, and for Japan, the cost of an aging population, which they are still grappling with, and their debt load is getting worse, much worse, even than ours at this point. Now, you may say, well, what can be done about this? Are we just throw up our hands and have to deal with higher inflation and higher interest rates and a slower economy and things like that? Well, not necessarily. I believe the single best thing that our government can do right now to try to control this whole monstrosity of debt is to allow more, and I mean much more, legal immigration of persons age 20 to 40, right? So these persons coming in would add to the labor pool, which would drive down inflation rates, right? They would also need to buy homes or rent apartments, buy automobiles to go to work and whatnot, which contributes to the growth of the economy. And they would not be pulling from Medicare or Social Security for at least 25 years, and actually more than that in the case of the younger workers. And they would be paying much more into the IRS structure of taxation, which would help bring at least attempt to bring expenditures in line with the income of the federal government. Now, all of this hinges upon the federal government also being able to reduce its spending. Now, it's already begun to do that. It's begun to wind down in the great weaning, as I call it, from the CV-19 inspired tremendous expenditures of 2020 and 2021. But that was unfortunately offset by more spending for the Mr. Biden's massive infrastructure program, and also there's some defense things coming up, and also his social infrastructure policy, which has not passed, but it's still hanging out there, and portions of it may be passed, and unless there are some kind of revenue enhancements, tax increases, that'll offset that. That's going to all add to an increasingly growing budget deficit and crisis going forward. But for right now, the best thing I feel from my analysis, whether it's from Latin America or Africa or Asia or Europe or Canada, wherever they're from, allow much, much more legal immigration of working aged people. And that will grow the economy. It'll put downward pressure on inflation, and it will add to the pool of persons that support Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the federal budget writ large. Okay, so those are my thoughts for this week. Let me know what you think. What, if anything, can be done to bring down the deficit and the debt? I'd love to know. Also, if you found this video instructive, informative, hit that thumbs up button for me, please. I would really appreciate it. And of course, subscribe! Subscribe to Invest Strong. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, friends, and good blessings.